Hi, it's Nicole. This month I read one Jacobean play, one Elizabethan play, one urban fantasy and a children's novel from the early 20th century. I also have a podcast to recommend today. The Duchess of Malfi. The Duchess of Malfi I read in the Norton Anthology. The whole play is included in here. The Duchess of Malfi is the first Elizabethan / Jacobean play I have read that is not Shakespeare. I read it as a context for Shakespeare, but now I think it's definitely strong enough to stand under the spotlight on its own 2 feet. Just to give you some context, John Webster was born about 15 years after Shakespeare. The Duchess of Malfi was written and performed around 1613. Shakespeare's last 3 plays, The Tempest, Henry VIII, and The Two Noble Kinsmen, were written about the same time. The Duchess of Malfi is usually described as a revenge tragedy. There are a few interesting things to notice. It's a tragedy because almost everybody dies by the end. There were bodies on stage everywhere. There's a bit in Shakespeare in Love, the film, when someone asked John Webster which was his favorite Shakespeare play, he said Titus Andronicus. I don't know if it's historically true, but I can see the director or the screenwriter winking at me. The Duchess is the main character. The play is named after her. I made a video all about her astonishing personality. I showed you her personality by Act 3 because it's worth watching and I don't want to spoil it for you, so I stopped at Act 3. I've just said it's a revenge tragedy, but the revenge bit is actually not about her. The revenge is carried out by another key character called Bosola. Bosola is a complicated character who's worth studying. He's a murderer who turns into an avenger after a change of heart halfway through the play. The Duchess is a strong character, but her love and hate is straightforward. In contrast, it's a bit of a roller coaster emotionally and morally for Bosola. It'll be interesting to study him, to think about the reasons he becomes a murderer in the first place, the reasons he changes his mind, and the reasons for his revenge, and in the end, the price he pays. I watched the Globe production in the candlelit Wanamaker Indoor Theatre. It was fabulous. I started the year with Twelfth Night, and this is my second Shakespeare's play. I'm still on track. I'm very happy to report, though we are only 3 months into the year, so we shall see how it goes. Richard II is probably the first play that I watched performed on stage before I read a word on the page. I watched the Hollow Crown TV series with Ben Whishaw playing Richard II. It's now really hard to separate the image of Richard II from Ben Whishaw because he did such a fantastic job. I loved it. Richard II is about the downfall of a king. It goes downhill so fast. If you think of the curves, a comedy goes like this and a tragedy goes like this. The high point of his career as a king happens in Act 1 and it's like this. And it goes just lower and lower until his grave. The language is beautiful, especially Act 4, Scene 1. I feel like everything is just building up to Act 4, Scene 1. I was really impatient to get there. His speeches when he gives his crown away are breathtaking. He might have lost his crown, but he does not lose to anyone in speaking. Everyone, including Henry Bolingbroke, is almost speechless in that scene. He really should have been a poet. I'll make a separate video about this play, so I won't say more. I tried to learn a bit more about the historical Richard II before I read the play, and I ended up listening to a podcast called Rest is History. It's not a new podcast. They started in November 2020, and it's not a small podcast either. It's the highest ranked UK history podcast on Spotify and Apple, and it's in the top 10 in the US too. If you are a regular listener to the excellent Rest is History, please say hello in the comment. So for Richard II, they have a 4-part series on that bit of the history. Part 1 and 2 is on the Peasants' Revolt, which happened when Richard II was the king, aged 14. Then Episode 3, Richard II himself, and very interestingly, the series concludes with Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales. I loved it. It was superb. Then I went down the rabbit hole, obviously you have to, and looked through their entire 400 plus episode backlog. So far, I have listened to episodes on Hogwarts and the history of public school in England, Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings, the trials of Oscar Wilde, Hitler and the Mitford sisters, Cleopatra, and all sorts of interesting topics that are related to literature but discussed from a history point of view. It's hosted by Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook. I haven't studied them, but my impression is Tom Holland is a historian on really old stuff like ancient Rome, medieval Europe and Britain. Dominic Sandbrook is more of an expert on modern British history. He wrote a series of chunky books on Britain in the 60s and 70s. I have White Heat on Britain in the 60s. I didn't realize the host of the podcast was the author of this book. I bought this ages ago and really enjoyed reading it, but it's so big I lost steam about here. If you love history and knowledgeable, intelligent, and often funny discussions, I highly recommend this podcast. I talked about Rivers of London so much last year that I feel like I don't need to introduce it anymore. Just briefly, Rivers of London is an urban fantasy series about police constable wizard apprentice Peter Grant from a department of London Metropolitan Police that deals with unusual and supernatural crimes called The Folly in Russell Square. The storyline is about solving mysteries and catching baddies. The Hanging Tree is the 6th novel in the series. It starts with a group of teenagers who broke undetected into a high-security, super posh apartment for a wild party, and one of them dropped dead after a drug overdose. But it turned out she wasn't killed by a drug overdose, but by a magic overdose. So in this world, anyone can perform magic if you read some books or if someone teaches you. But if you are not trained properly and end up using magic wrongly, it can turn your brain into cauliflower and kill you. Before I tell you one thing I love about it, here's a complaint. I really struggle with the number of characters and how fast the plot moves. I can't keep up. You also need to remember the characters from previous books in the series. It's one of those you have to read from the beginning. I need a Wikipedia page explaining their relationships and previous involvement in the cases, please. But the characters are superb in each scene. I talked a lot about what I love about these stories in my previous videos. For this one, I love how the author makes use of real historical figures as well as makes up fictional ones, and he mixes them up so to give credit to the story. Some of these guys' backstories and some of the cases that they investigate go way back in history. Therefore, you get this sense that these characters must exist in real life, just like those historical figures did. And if I go to London and weird stuff happens, Peter Grant might turn up to the scene. I love it. For example, one of the fictional characters had photos taken by David Bailey in 1964. This is David Bailey. You might know David Bailey was one of the most famous fashion photographers in London. This is David Bailey and Jean Shrimpton during the swinging 60s. Another guy called Jonathan Wild is mentioned as part of a case. Jonathan Wild says on his own Wikipedia page, who lived from 1682-83 to 1725, was a London underworld figure notable for operating on both sides of the law, posing as public-spirited thief-taker general. He simultaneously ran a significant crime empire and used his crime-fighting role to remove rivals and launder the proceeds of his own crimes. Another more obvious example is, of course, Isaac Newton, the founder of folly. I'll read you a little bit. Because back in the go-ahead post-Renaissance, pre-Enlightenment days of the 17th century, there was no science or magic as such. It was all natural philosophy, and people hadn't quite got around to deciding which was which. Back then, chemists hadn't had that dangerously foreign O removed, and Sir Isaac Newton wanted all the answers to everything. How long the universe was going to last, the exact date of God's creation, how to make the philosopher's stone, and why do things that go up have to come back down again. In those days, the idea that large celestial bodies might influence the trajectory of other bodies without an actual material connection of some kind was the stuff of magic, not rationalist thought. Vast, invisible spheres of crystal, it was the only rational explanation. Next, you'll be claiming diseases aren't caused by bad smells. A lavender nosegay, that's your friend. Sir Isaac Newton legendarily wrote the famous Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, excuse my Latin, which gave us principles that a couple of 100 years later were good enough to land a man on the moon. Then he wrote the slightly less well-known Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Artis Magicis, which codified the magical techniques that allow me, this is Peter Grant, to inconvenience paper targets and Nightingale to demolish small agriculture buildings. I love how the author mixes up history and fiction. Fabulous. The last one is The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. I'm really glad I read this. It's an adventure story of 4 animals, the mole, the rat, the badger, and the toad. It starts with the mole after abandoning his spring cleaning to chase after the call of spring. He met the water rat. They went on a pleasant little boating trip where the badger and the toad make a quick appearance. The toad had this habit of getting over enthusiastic about one mode of transport and then getting over it shortly in pursuit of the next trendy thing. But when he set his heart on motor cars this time, he got himself into deep, deep trouble. I love the writing, especially the author's way of describing actions or a scene. I've been reading through them and highlighting all the sentences I love. This edition also has E.H. Shepard's illustrations, the guy who illustrated Winnie the Pooh. There are some adorable scenes. I will only read you one. One afternoon, when the rat in his armchair before the blaze was alternately dozing and trying over rhymes that wouldn't fit, he formed the resolution to go out by himself and explore the wildwood and perhaps strike up an acquaintance with Mr. Badger. So the mole went against the rat's advice. When the rat woke up, the mole was gone. By this point, the mole had got lost and scared to death in the woods. The faithful rat searched as the wood grew darker and colder and found the mole in a shivering heap. They finally found somewhere to stay the night, and after some further adventures, they got to walk home the next morning. So, this is what happened on their way home. We others, who have long lost the more subtle of the physical senses, have not even proper terms to express an animal's intercommunications with his surroundings, living or otherwise, and have only the word smell, for instance, to include the whole range of delicate thrills which murmur in the nose of the animal night and day, summoning, warning, inciting, repelling. It was one of these mysterious fairy calls from out the void that suddenly reached Mole in the darkness, making him tingle through and through with its very familiar appeal, even while as yet he could not clearly remember what it was. He stopped dead in his tracks, his nose searching hither and thither in its efforts to recapture the fine filament, the telegraphic current that had so strongly moved him. A moment, and he had caught it again, and with it, this time, came recollection in fullest flood. Home, that was what they meant. Those caressing appeals, those soft touches wafted through the air, those invisible little hands pulling and tugging, all one way. Why, it must be quite close by him at that moment, his old home that he had hurriedly forsaken and never thought again, that day when he first found the river. And now it was sending out its scouts and its messengers to capture him and bring him in. Since his escape on that bright morning, he had hardly given it a thought, so absorbed had he been in his new life, in all its pleasures, its surprises, its fresh and captivating experiences. Now, with a rush of old memories, how clearly it stood up before him in the darkness. Shabby indeed, and small and poorly furnished, and yet his, the home he had made for himself, the home he had been so happy to get back to after his day's work. And the home had been happy with him too, evidently, and was missing him, and wanted him back, and was telling him so, through his nose, sorrowfully, reproachfully, but with no bitterness or anger, only with plaintive reminder that it was there and wanted him. The call was clear, the summons was plain. He must obey it instantly and go. "Ratty," he called, full of joyful excitement. "Hold on, come back, I want you, quickly." "Oh, come on, Mole, do," replied the rat cheerfully, still plodding along. "Please stop, Ratty," pleaded the poor mole in anguish of heart. "You don't understand. It's my home, my old home. I've just come across the smell of it. It's close by here, really quite close. I must go to it. I must. Oh, come back, Ratty. Please, please come back." The rat was by this time very far ahead, too far to hear clearly what the mole was calling, too far to catch the sharp note of painful appeal in his voice, and he was much taken up with the weather, for he too could smell something suspiciously like approaching snow. "Mole, we mustn't stop now, really," he called back. "We'll come for it tomorrow, whatever it is you've found. But I dare not stop now. It's late, and the snow's coming on again, and I'm not sure of the way, and I want your nose, Mole, so come on quickly, there's a good fellow." And the rat pressed forward on his way without waiting for an answer. Poor Mole stood along in the road, his heart torn asunder, and a big sob gathering somewhere low down inside him, to leap up to the surface presently. He knew, in passionate escape. But even under such a test as this, his loyalty to his friend stood firm. Never for a moment did he dream of abandoning him. Meanwhile, the wolves of his old home pleaded, whispered, conjured, and finally claimed him imperiously. He dare not tarry longer within this magic circle. With a wrench that tore his very heartstrings, He set his face down the road and followed submissively in the track of the rat, while faint, thin little smells, still dogging his retreating nose, reproached him for his new friendship and his callous forgetfulness. With an effort he caught up the unsuspecting rat, who began chattering cheerfully about what they would do when they got back, and how jolly a fire of logs in the parlour would be, and what a supper he meant to eat, never noticing his companion's silence and distressful state of mind. At last, however, when they had gone some considerable way further, and were passing some tree stumps at the edge of a copse that bordered the road, he stopped and said kindly, "Look here, Mo, old chap, you seem dead tired. No talk left in you, and your feet dragging like lead. We'll sit down here for a minute and rest. The snow has held off so far, and the best part of our journey is over." The mole subsided forlornly on the tree stump and tried to control himself, for he felt it surely coming. The sob he had fought so long refused to be beaten. Up and up it forced its way to the air, and then another, and another, and others thick and fast, till poor Mo at last gave up the struggle and cried freely and helplessly and openly, now that he knew it was all over, and he had lost what he could hardly be said to be found. The rat, astonished and dismayed at the violence of Mo's paroxysm of grief, did not dare to speak for a while. At last he said, very quietly and sympathetically, "What is it, old fellow? Whatever can be the matter? Tell us your trouble, and let me see what I can do." Poor Mo found it difficult to get any words out between the upheavals of his chest that followed one upon another so quickly, and held back speech and choked it as it came. "I know it's a shabby, dingy little place," he sobbed forth at last, brokenly. "Not like your cozy quarters, or Toad's beautiful hall, or Badger's great house, but it was my own little home, and I was fond of it, and I went away and forgot all about it. And then I smelt it suddenly, on the road when I called, and you wouldn't listen, rat, and everything came back to me with a rush, and I wanted it. Oh dear, when you wouldn't turn back, Ratty, and I had to leave it, though I was smelling it all the time. I thought my heart would break. We might have just gone and had one look at it, Ratty, only one look. It was close by, but you wouldn't turn back, Ratty. You wouldn't turn back. Oh dear, oh dear." Recollection brought fresh waves of sorrow, and sobs again took full charge of him, preventing further speech. The rat stared straight in front of him, saying nothing, only patted Mo gently on the shoulder. After a time he muttered gloomily, "I see it all now. What a pig I have been. A pig, that's me. Just a pig. A plain pig." He waited till Mo's sobs became gradually less stormy and more rhythmical. He waited till at last sniffs were frequent and sobs only intermittent. Then he rose from his seat and, remarking carelessly, "Well, now we'd really better be getting on, old chap," set off up the road again, over the toilsome way they had come. "Wherever are you going, Ratty?" cried the tearful Mo, looking up in alarm. "We are going to find that home of yours, old fellow," replied the rat pleasantly. "So you had better come along, for it will take some finding, and we shall want your nose." I love it. It's so sweet. On that note, that's all for today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in my next one.